I never thought sXXing my boyfriend on top of his SUV in a remote forest would end with mysterious sounds in the darkness and us frozen in terror all night thinking we were being stalked. But here we are. I'm a 27-year-old elementary school teacher, and this is the story of how one romantic camping trip seeking privacy and stargazing turned into a night of paranoia and fear that fundamentally changed how we approach outdoor adventures and made us both significantly more cautious about isolation and vulnerability in the wilderness. Ethan and I had been together for 2 years when this happened, and honestly, he'd transformed my entire relationship with the outdoors during that time. We met through mutual friends at a backyard barbecue on a warm summer evening, and I remember being immediately drawn to him when he started talking passionately about his work as a landscape designer. He works outdoors every single day, loves nature with this infectious enthusiasm, and has this whole philosophy about how modern people have become too disconnected from the natural world. Before meeting Ethan, I was definitely more of an indoor person. Give me a good book and a comfortable couch over dirt and bugs any day. But he gradually got me into hiking and camping, showing me the real beauty of forests and trails and sleeping under stars in ways I'd never appreciated before. He made me see how peaceful and restorative it could be to get away from the constant noise and stimulation of city life. And honestly, he changed my hobbies, changed how I spent my weekends, and in some fundamental way, changed who I was as a person. Over our 2 years together, we'd gone camping maybe a dozen times, and we'd gradually worked our way up from beginner to more advanced experiences. We started with established campgrounds that had all the amenities: bathrooms with running water, designated fire pits, other campers nearby for safety and social interaction. It was safe and easy and comfortable, perfect for someone like me who was new to the whole outdoor experience. But as we both got more comfortable with camping and I gained more confidence in my abilities, we started seeking out more remote locations. We graduated to backcountry sites that required hiking in with all your gear, then dispersed camping in areas where you might not see another person for days at a time. Ethan absolutely loved that isolation, that feeling of being truly alone in genuine wilderness, completely disconnected from civilization and all its demands. I was learning to love it too, or at least I thought I was learning to love it, before that October night showed me the darker side of that isolation. That particular October, about a month before everything fell apart, Ethan suggested we do a weekend camping trip to a national forest a few hours outside the city. He wasn't talking about the main national park itself with its visitor centers and ranger stations, but rather the adjacent forest land where free camping was allowed and there were no designated sites or facilities. You just find a spot that looks good, pull off the road, and set up camp wherever you want. He'd been spending his lunch breaks at work researching locations on satellite maps and reading trip reports on forums, and he'd found what he thought was the perfect spot. He described it enthusiastically: a grove of old growth trees surrounding a small clearing, a stream running nearby for water, far enough from main roads that we'd have complete privacy and silence. It sounded perfect for what we both wanted: privacy for intimacy and amazing stargazing away from any light pollution. I agreed immediately, excited about another adventure with him, and we spent the next few weeks planning and gathering supplies. Friday after work, we loaded up Ethan's SUV with all our gear: tent, sleeping bags, camp stove, food, water, all the equipment we'd need for a weekend in the wilderness. We left the city around 6 p.m., driving north through increasingly rural areas as the sun got lower on the horizon. The drive took us about 3 hours through winding mountain roads, and by the time we actually reached the national forest boundary, it was already completely dark outside. We used our headlamps to navigate the forest roads, which were really just rough dirt tracks that barely qualified as roads at all. They were more like suggestions of where vehicles might be able to go, rutted and rocky and requiring careful navigation, even in Ethan's high-clearance SUV. We drove slowly, watching for the landmarks Ethan had identified from his satellite map research, until finally we found the grove he'd been looking for. He pulled the SUV into the clearing, killed the engine, and we sat for a moment in the sudden silence, just listening to the forest sounds around us. Wind rustling through the trees, night birds calling in the distance, and somewhere not too far away, the gentle sound of water running over rocks. The silence felt profound after hours of engine noise and road rumble. It was beautiful and peaceful and exactly what we'd been hoping for when we planned this trip. We got out and started setting up our campsite using our headlamps to see, working together with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. We pitched our tent near the SUV on a flat spot we'd cleared of rocks and sticks, set up our cooler with food under a tree, arranged our camp stove on a stable surface, and rolled out our sleeping bags inside the tent. After camp was established, we made a simple dinner on the camp stove. Nothing fancy, just dehydrated camping food that we heated up with boiling water. We ate by the light of our battery-powered lantern, sitting on a log and talking about our stressful weeks at work, decompressing and letting go of all the tension and responsibilities we'd left behind in the city. After dinner, we carefully cleaned up everything, making sure not to leave any food scraps around, and then hung our bear bag from a high tree branch far from camp. This was a standard safety precaution in bear country. You put all your food and anything scented into a bag and hang it high and far from where you're sleeping, so bears won't be attracted to your campsite during the night. After we'd finished setting up camp and securing our food, Ethan had an idea for how to spend the evening. He suggested we put our sleeping pads on top of his SUV and lie up there looking at the stars, getting us up off the ground for a better view of the sky without any trees blocking our vision. I loved the idea immediately. It sounded romantic and adventurous and exactly the kind of thing we'd come out here to do. We grabbed our foam sleeping pads and some warm blankets and climbed up onto the roof of the SUV, using the bumper and roof rack as makeshift ladder rungs. We spread everything out on top to create a comfortable nest, lay down next to each other with blankets pulled over us against the October chill, and looked up at the sky spread out above us. The view was absolutely incredible, unlike anything I'd ever seen before in my life. There was zero light pollution out here, nothing but pure darkness and the natural light of the stars, and the sky was just packed with millions of points of light. The Milky Way was clearly visible as this cloudy band stretching across the entire sky, and every few minutes we'd see shooting stars streaking across, leaving brief trails of light behind them. I'd lived my entire life in or near cities where you can only see the brightest stars, and I'd never experienced a sky like this, never understood what people meant when they talked about being able to see the universe. We lay there together for at least an hour, maybe longer, talking softly about everything and nothing. We pointed out the few constellations we could actually identify, the Big Dipper, Orion's Belt, Cassiopeia, and made up ridiculous stories about the ones we couldn't name. Ethan told me myths and legends about various stars and constellations that he'd learned somewhere, and I listened with my head on his shoulder, feeling completely content and at peace. At some point, Ethan shifted closer and put his arm around me, pulling me against him for warmth as the temperature continued to drop. He kissed my forehead gently and said quietly that he loved moments like this more than anything. Just the two of us and the universe, no distractions or interference or demands from the outside world. Just existing together in this perfect, peaceful moment. I agreed wholeheartedly, feeling exactly the same way, and I felt this wave of gratitude wash over me for him introducing me to these kinds of experiences, for showing me this whole side of life I'd been missing before we met. The gentle kiss on my forehead naturally led to more kissing, deeper and more passionate, as we held each other close under the blankets. His hands started wandering over my body, and mine explored his, both of us becoming increasingly aware that we were completely alone out here. The nearest person was probably miles away in any direction, and there was absolutely no one who could see or hear us, no matter what we did. That sense of complete privacy and freedom was intoxicating in a way that's hard to describe. We could do absolutely anything up here under the stars, and nobody would ever know. We started getting more intimate and more physical despite the cold air, removing layers of clothing with fumbling fingers, and eventually we were sXXing right there on top of his SUV under the most beautiful starry sky I'd ever seen. It felt wild and free and absolutely perfect. Exactly the kind of transcendent experience we'd been hoping for when we drove all the way out here. We were completely lost in each other and in the intensity of the moment, not paying any attention to our surroundings, not thinking about where we were or what might be out there in the darkness surrounding our little island of light. Just focused entirely on the physical sensations and the emotional connection and this perfect moment of intimacy under the stars. Then suddenly, there was a sound that cut through everything. The distinct sharp crack of a large branch breaking somewhere in the darkness beyond our campsite. It wasn't the small snapping sound of a twig under a squirrel's feet, but the loud crack of a substantial branch, the kind of sound that means something heavy just stepped on it with significant weight. We both froze instantly, stopping all movement, stopping our breathing, just listening intently to the darkness around us. For a few seconds, there was only silence, and I started to think maybe we'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a dead tree branch finally giving way under its own weight. But then we heard another sound, and then another. Something was definitely moving through the undergrowth out there in the forest. The movement was slow and deliberate. Not the quick scampering of a small animal, but the careful, methodical movement of something large making its way through the trees. And it was getting closer to our campsite. Ethan whispered right next to my ear, his voice tense and barely audible, telling me not to move and to stay completely quiet. He was clearly hoping that whatever was out there would just pass by, that maybe it was just a deer or elk moving through the area on their regular nighttime travels and would ignore our campsite entirely if we didn't draw attention to ourselves. But I could hear the fear in his voice despite his attempt to sound calm, and that scared me even more than the sounds themselves. His body had gone rigid against mine, every muscle tensed and ready, and I could feel his heart pounding as hard as my own. We lay there completely frozen, still partially undressed and completely exposed on top of the vehicle with absolutely nowhere to hide, just waiting and hoping and praying that whatever was making those sounds would change direction and move away from us instead of toward us. The sounds continued and seemed to be getting even closer to where we were. Now I could actually hear breathing in addition to the footsteps and rustling. Heavy, labored breathing like something large exerting itself to move through the forest. The sound was coming from the direction of our tent and our campsite, from the area where we'd hung our food bag earlier. My mind immediately jumped to bears, because of course it did. We were in bear country, and we'd talked about bears when we hung the food bag, and now something big was moving around our camp in the middle of the night. Maybe it was a black bear attracted by the smell of food, or maybe it was something else, something even more dangerous. I couldn't tell in the darkness and honestly didn't want to know. My fear was absolute and primal, the kind of terror that shuts down rational thinking and just fills your entire body with the overwhelming urge to run, to escape, to get away from danger by any means necessary. Ethan slowly reached for his phone, moving as carefully and quietly as possible to avoid drawing attention to our position on top of the SUV. He turned on the phone's flashlight function and aimed the bright beam toward where the sounds were coming from, sweeping it across the trees and undergrowth, trying to see what was out there. The sudden light illuminated the forest around us. We could see the trunks of trees, the dense undergrowth, the shadows cast by branches. But we couldn't see whatever was making the sounds. There was nothing visible in the beam of light, no animal with glowing eyes, no human figure, nothing at all that would explain the sounds we were clearly hearing. But even though we couldn't see anything, the sounds continued, and now they seemed to be coming from a different direction entirely. From behind us instead of in front. It was like whatever was out there had somehow moved around us without being visible in the flashlight beam. Like it was deliberately circling our position, maybe stalking us, maybe watching us from the darkness and waiting for the right moment to do something. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, could feel it hammering against my ribcage like it was trying to escape from my chest. The terror I felt was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before in my life. I've had nightmares that felt less frightening than this reality. We were completely vulnerable up here on top of the SUV, exposed from all sides, with no weapons and no protection, and no way to defend ourselves if something decided to attack. If whatever was making those sounds could climb or jump, we were done for. We were just helpless prey in the darkness, waiting to be hunted, completely at the mercy of whatever was circling us in the night. Then suddenly, cutting through the darkness and my spiraling panic, we saw more lights. Distant lights moving through the trees from a different direction than the sounds had been coming from. Multiple flashlight beams were bobbing and weaving between the tree trunks, and we could hear voices, human voices calling to each other in the distance. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. These were people, other human beings, not some wild predator stalking us in the darkness. We weren't alone out here after all. But almost as quickly as the relief came, a new fear replaced it. Who were these people and what were they doing walking through this remote forest in the middle of the night? Why were they here in this specific area where we'd thought we'd be completely alone? Had they heard us earlier, heard the sounds we'd been making when we were sXXing on top of the SUV? Had they seen us somehow? Were they coming to our camp specifically, and if so, what did they want from us? Ethan called out into the darkness, his voice uncertain but trying to sound confident and unthreatening. "Hey, anyone there? We're just campers up here. We're sleeping for the night." The moving lights stopped immediately when they heard his voice, and the distant voices went quiet, leaving several long seconds of tense silence where we could hear absolutely nothing at all. Then finally, a voice called back from the darkness, and it sounded young and male and honestly just as scared as we felt. "Sorry, we didn't know anyone was out here. We're just hiking through. We got turned around and lost the trail. We're trying to find our way back to the main road." The voice sounded genuinely apologetic and confused, not threatening at all, and I felt another wave of relief wash over me. These were just other campers or hikers who were lost in the dark, not dangerous strangers with bad intentions. Ethan, bless him, pulled himself together enough to give them directions back to civilization. He told them how to navigate back to the main forest road using landmarks they could identify even in the darkness, which way to turn when they reached certain forks in the trail, roughly how far they'd have to walk before they'd start seeing signs of the main road. They thanked him profusely, said they were sorry for disturbing us and they'd leave us alone now, and then the lights started moving away from our position, gradually getting fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely into the forest. The voices faded into the distance until we couldn't hear them anymore, and then we were alone again in the darkness and silence. But even though the immediate threat was gone, the adrenaline was still absolutely pumping through my system, and the fear was still very much present. The sense of safety and isolation that we'd felt earlier in the evening had been completely shattered, transformed from comforting privacy into threatening vulnerability. We couldn't relax anymore, couldn't just lie here under the stars enjoying each other's company and the beauty of nature, because now we were hyper-aware of every single sound and shadow, interpreting everything as potential danger. We quickly decided without even really discussing it that we needed to get down from the exposed position on top of the SUV and get into the tent where we'd at least feel somewhat more protected and hidden. I knew rationally that a thin nylon tent wouldn't actually protect us from anything real. A bear could tear through it in seconds. A person could unzip it or cut through it easily, but emotionally, it felt safer to be enclosed and hidden rather than lying out in the open where we could be seen from any direction. We climbed down from the roof of the SUV, gathered up our sleeping pads and blankets with shaking hands, and hustled over to the tent as quickly as we could. We practically dove inside, zipped the door shut behind us like that thin zipper would somehow keep out whatever dangers lurked in the darkness, and burrowed into our sleeping bags fully clothed. We lay there side by side, not sleeping, not even really resting, just listening intently to every single sound coming from outside the tent. Every tiny noise was amplified by our fear and made to seem significant and threatening. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every breath of wind through the trees, Every call of a night bird, every sound that in daylight would have seemed perfectly normal and natural, now seemed like potential danger approaching our vulnerable tent. The rational part of my brain kept trying to tell me that we were fine, that the mysterious sounds had probably just been deer moving through the forest, and the hikers had been exactly what they claimed to be, lost people trying to find their way back to safety. But the primitive fear center of my brain was having none of it. That part of my brain was absolutely convinced that we were in danger, that something was still out there watching us, that we needed to stay alert and ready to run at any moment. Neither of us slept at all that night. We just lay there rigid and alert in our sleeping bags, staring up at the tent ceiling we couldn't actually see in the darkness, listening to the forest sounds and our own breathing and our racing hearts. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each minute feeling like an hour, each hour feeling like an entire night. Gradually, so gradually, I almost didn't notice it at first. The absolute pitch darkness inside the tent started to lighten just slightly. I could begin to make out vague shapes. The outline of Ethan next to me, the curve of the tent wall, our backpacks piled in the corner. Dawn was finally approaching, and with the coming daylight came a sense of relief and safety that I can barely describe. I knew logically that daytime wasn't actually safer than nighttime. If there was a real predator or threat out there, it could attack just as easily in daylight as in darkness. But emotionally, psychologically, the sunrise felt like salvation, like we'd survived the night and made it through to safety. As soon as there was enough light to see properly, we made a silent mutual decision that we were getting the hell out of there immediately. We didn't make breakfast, didn't sit around drinking coffee and enjoying the morning like we normally would have done on a camping trip. We just threw everything into the SUV as quickly as possible. Tent shoved in still damp, sleeping bags unrolled and tossed in loose, everything just thrown in without our usual careful packing. We just wanted to leave. To get back to civilization and safety and places with other people and structures and all the protection that modern society provides. Neither of us spoke much during the packing process, both too exhausted and still too shaken to make conversation, both just focused on the single goal of getting out of there as quickly as humanly possible. We got home around noon after the long drive back, and we unpacked the SUV in continued silence, both of us moving like zombies, exhausted but too wired to actually rest. Ethan finally broke the silence to apologize, saying he should have chosen somewhere less remote for camping, somewhere that would have felt safer and had other people nearby. I told him honestly that it wasn't his fault, that we'd both wanted isolation and privacy, that we'd both accepted the theoretical risks of camping in a remote area without really thinking through what those risks might actually feel like if they became real. It's one thing to intellectually understand that camping in remote wilderness has inherent dangers, and it's a completely different thing to actually feel threatened and unsafe and vulnerable in the darkness. The real fear, the visceral physical experience of terror, changes everything in ways you can't really understand until you've lived through it. The days immediately following our return home were really difficult for both of us. I found myself completely unable to shake the paranoid feeling that had settled deep into my bones and nervous system. Every little sound in my apartment made me jump. The old building settling and creaking, a car door slamming out on the street, the air conditioning kicking on, even just the refrigerator compressor starting up would send my heart racing and flood my body with adrenaline. Shadows that I'd never paid any attention to before suddenly seemed threatening and ominous, and I'd catch myself staring at dark corners of rooms expecting something to emerge from them. Nighttime, which had always been my favorite part of the day when I could finally relax after work, became something I actively dreaded. I'd lie in bed unable to fall asleep, my mind replaying those sounds from the forest over and over, reimagining what might have been making them, creating increasingly frightening scenarios about what could have happened to us if things had gone differently. When I finally did manage to fall asleep from sheer exhaustion, I'd wake up multiple times gasping from vivid nightmares where something was chasing me through endless dark forests, hunting me down while I ran, desperately trying to escape, but never able to get away, always trapped in the trees with the predator getting closer and closer. Ethan was going through something very similar, I'd catch him staring out windows with this distant, haunted expression on his face. Or I'd see him flinch and tense up at sudden sounds that wouldn't have registered for him at all before that night in the forest. About a week after we got back, we finally sat down together and had a real deep conversation about what had happened, moving beyond the surface level reassurances and "we're fine" statements we'd been giving each other. We tried to seriously analyze why we'd been so terrified, whether those sounds in the forest had actually represented a real threat, or if they were just completely normal forest noises that our fear and vulnerability had amplified and transformed into something monstrous in our imaginations. We talked through all the possibilities we could think of. It could have been deer moving through the area, or elk, or even just the wind causing branches to fall and create those sounds we'd heard. The lost hikers we'd encountered had provided a rational explanation for at least some of what we'd experienced. Logically, using all our reasoning and rational thought, we concluded that there probably hadn't been anything actually dangerous out there, that we'd most likely just freaked ourselves out and let our imaginations run wild in the darkness when we were in a vulnerable position. But even though we could intellectually conclude that the threat probably wasn't real, we couldn't deny that the fear we'd felt that night had been absolutely real, and the vulnerability and exposure we'd experienced lying on top of that SUV had been undeniably real, and those experiences had fundamentally changed how we both thought about remote camping and wilderness isolation. Sitting there at my kitchen table with cups of coffee going cold in front of us, we made new rules and established new boundaries for any future outdoor adventures we might have together. We agreed that we'd still go camping because we both genuinely did love it and didn't want to give it up entirely based on one frightening experience, but we committed to taking significantly more precautions than we'd been taking before. From now on, we'd thoroughly research any area before going there, not just looking at pretty satellite photos, but reading recent trip reports and checking for any warnings about wildlife or other hazards. We'd stay closer to established campsites where other people would likely be nearby, even if not immediately visible, rather than seeking out the most remote locations possible. We'd always bring protection, bear spray at absolute minimum, maybe even an air horn or other noise-making devices to scare off wildlife. We'd tell friends or family members exactly where we planned to camp, providing GPS coordinates or at least detailed directions, and we'd commit to checking in with them regularly so that someone would know to send help if we didn't return when expected. All these basic safety measures that we'd been casual and cavalier about before, treating them as optional rather than essential, suddenly seemed like absolute necessities that we should have been following all along. That night in the forest had taught us in the most visceral way possible that isolation cuts both ways. It provides the privacy and freedom and escape from society that we'd been seeking, yes, but it also creates vulnerability and risk and removes the safety net of having other people nearby who could help if something went wrong. Several months passed before we worked up the courage and desire to actually go camping again, and when we finally did venture back out into the wilderness, everything felt completely different than it had before. We were hyper-vigilant and cautious about choosing our location. We were over-prepared with our gear and safety equipment almost to a ridiculous degree, and we were constantly aware of our surroundings at all times rather than being able to relax and immerse ourselves in nature. We still enjoyed being outdoors and sleeping under the stars because those are objectively beautiful experiences, but that sense of innocent invincibility we'd had before, that feeling that nothing could really go wrong and we were safe in the wilderness, was completely and irrevocably gone. It had been replaced by a much more mature and realistic respect for the natural world, for the very real dangers that wilderness contains, and for all the unknown threats that darkness and isolation can hide from view. Ethan reflected one evening as we sat by our campfire at a well-established campground surrounded by other campers that maybe losing that dangerous innocence was actually a positive thing in the long run, that maybe we'd been way too reckless and overconfident in our abilities before, and that the fear we now carried would actually keep us safer and help us make better decisions. I had to agree with his assessment. It's definitely better to be careful and cautious and alive than to be overconfident and reckless and potentially dead because you took unnecessary risks. Now, a full year after that terrifying October night that changed everything, we've reached a point where we can actually joke about the experience and find humor in what happened to us. We've turned it into a story we tell, calling it our night of terror, or referring to whatever made those mysterious sounds as our forest stalker. And the whole incident has become part of our relationship's shared mythology and history. We frame it as this adventure we survived together, this challenge we faced down side by side. And in a strange way, the experience did make us stronger as a couple and more connected to each other. We came out the other end more aware of ourselves and each other, more appreciative of safety and preparation, and more committed to protecting each other. Now, whenever we go camping, without fail and with perfect consistency, one of us will reference that October night. We'll wonder out loud with exaggerated spooky voices whether tonight might be the night we finally meet the monster again, and we'll laugh together at our shared private joke. But even while we're laughing and making light of it, we're also carefully checking our surroundings with flashlights, staying alert to any unusual sounds in the darkness, and remembering very clearly the lessons we learned that night about vulnerability and danger and the importance of preparation. Looking back on everything now with the perspective that a year provides, I can see that the experience changed both of us in profound and lasting ways. But it didn't break us or destroy our relationship or our love of nature and outdoor adventures. It transformed how we interact with the wilderness, but it didn't end that interaction entirely. Instead, it made us into smarter and more competent campers, more properly prepared for potential dangers, and significantly more respectful of the environment we're entering when we go into wild places. And I think that's the real lesson that we ultimately took away from all of this, the wisdom that was worth the price of that terrifying night. It's not just the simple fact that wilderness can be dangerous, though that's certainly true and important to remember. The deeper lesson is that vulnerability is a very real thing that deserves serious acknowledgement and respect, that fear serves an important evolutionary purpose in keeping us alive and safe, that caution and thorough preparation are what ultimately keep you breathing and unharmed, and perhaps most importantly, that shared trauma and difficulty, when you work through it together with someone you truly love and trust, can actually transform into shared strength and resilience, into a shared story that binds you closer together and into fuel for shared growth and development as both individuals and as a couple. That's what we ultimately got from that awful, terrifying October night in the forest, when mysterious sounds in the darkness made us feel hunted and vulnerable and afraid for our lives. Yes, we experienced genuine terror and weeks of sleepless nights and lingering paranoia that took months to fully process and move past. But we also gained hard-won wisdom about ourselves and about nature. We developed a new perspective on risk and safety and preparation, and we came away with a deep and lasting appreciation for taking risks seriously instead of treating outdoor adventures as consequence-free entertainment. We still go camping regularly and genuinely love being outdoors in nature and actively seek out new experiences and adventures in wild places. But we approach everything differently now, more carefully, more thoughtfully, more respectfully, with much better planning and preparation. We go into the forest with full awareness and acceptance that it's simultaneously beautiful and peaceful and potentially deadly. All three of those contradictory things at the exact same time, and we've made our peace with that complicated reality. And that's ultimately okay and even healthy. That's just what nature actually is, what life itself actually is. You just have to be smart about it and learn from your close calls and mistakes, adjust your behavior accordingly based on experience, and keep growing and evolving as a person. That's what we're doing together, what we'll keep doing for as long as we're together as a couple. We'll keep sleeping under the stars on clear nights, sometimes even on top of the car roof like we did that fateful October evening, but now we always have bear spray within easy arm's reach, a fully charged satellite phone in case of emergency, And we always make absolutely sure that someone back in civilization knows exactly where we are, just in case our mysterious forest monster ever decides to come back and make those sounds again. We'll be ready for it this time.